Distance has to be the most talked about thing in golf, especially when we're talking about how far we hit the golf ball. And if you're a longer hitter, I bet it's the number one thing that you brag about. But when talking about distance, there's a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of misconceptions as to how far we actually hit the golf ball. Well, today we're going to talk the truth. We're going to look at some data and look at some facts at how far actually golfers are hitting the golf ball. I'm going to do this by doing a gapping session. Gapping is massive for your game. I'm going to explain how to do it, the benefits you will see, and also expose those lies and maybe shock a few people along the way as to how far golfers actually are hitting the golf ball. So without further ado, let's find out how far the golf ball is going. So how are we going to do a gapping session? Well, there's probably three ways you could do your gapping session nowadays, thanks to the advancement of technology. Back in day, the first way that you would do it would probably be by using something like your laser. You would hit balls from a specific spot, maybe on your practice ground. You would walk out to where the middle of those golf balls would be. Let's say you've hit 10 golf balls, you walk out to the middle and you would laser back to where you were hitting from to find the average. Nowadays though, we have things like the top tracer range, so you're able to go down to the range, key in the clubs that you were using by using the app and the section in there that will help you actually track stuff, and then you could go through a session on the range. Or there is the more efficient way now, and what you would see the tour players doing, what you can do with a PGA professional, and if you're fortunate enough, if you do have your own launch monitor, you can do this as well. And that is by using a launch monitor and actually going through your bag, inputting all the clubs that you use and getting the average of all the shots that you hit with each club in your bag. Now, it's very important when you're doing this that you do a couple of things when going through the launch monitor phase. Number one, the golf ball that you're actually using. Make sure you use a ball that you actually use out on the golf course. If you walk in and let's say you play a Pro V1 and all of a sudden you're using a budget Strixon ball, your distances are going to be off there. The second thing would be actually when hitting the golf shots, especially when in a simulator, it is key that you will try and emulate the swing that you would put out on the golf course. It's easy in an environment like this to actually just stand here and try and hit it as hard as you physically can, because there's no repercussions. You're hitting it into a screen, there's no out of bounds, there's no water, there's no trees, so on and so forth. So try and emulate the swing that you would actually be using out on the golf course. For instance, I've got my 58 here. I'm going to start from the bottom of my bag and I'm going to work up as I'm doing so. And for my first swing of the day, all I'm going to try and do is imagine that I would just be hitting my normal full 58-degree wedge here. I'm probably expecting this to go around that 100 mark as I hit this one. So a nice rhythm that I would generally put onto the swing on the golf course. You can see there, just shy of it, was a little bit toe struck. But what you would then do, which is where the third and final part comes in, is take a sample group of the clubs that you are hitting. So I'm now just going to whiz through my 58, then we're going to stop at the 7-iron and have a look at how far golfers are actually hitting 7-iron, because there's a common answer when I actually ask my students of how far they hit the golf ball with a 7-iron. I could bet my bottom dollar I think I know what you think the answer would be to that one. So I would suggest maybe 3 shots with each club to start off with. If you've got time for 5, 10, fantastic. That way you're just going to get an average of what you're doing. Now, just before I move into my pitching wedge, one other thing to do with your wedges, i.e. your gap wedge, your lob wedge, sand wedge. When you're doing your gapping, is make sure there's not huge gaps between them, especially from your gap wedge to your pitching wedge. But one thing you might also want to do is work on a little bit of maybe a clock system, or I have a 3-point system in that I swing to where I feel where my lead arm gets to. So I have one where I feel where my belt swings to, or the arm swings to the belt, where it swings to the chest, and where it swings to the shoulders. From there then, those clubs you're generally not hitting full out. You'll have something that you'll get that you can measure those in between distances when you're maybe 30 yards to 100 yards. You'll know that maybe if you've got 2 wedges, you've got 6 options of swing that you can do with 2 wedges to try and find those gaps. Right, 7-iron. See how far this thing goes. Comment down below what you think the average 7-iron is for a mid-handicapper, 15 handicapper. So we've seen lob wedge to 7-iron there. You saw all the distances up to the 8-iron. You didn't see my 7-iron distance, but hopefully you were starting to spot a trend in those distances. Now, a couple of caveats before we get stuck into some data. Number one, when you are doing this, always work off carry numbers. Harder to do if you're working with the laser and you're doing it out on a field, but always try to work on carry distance if you're using the launch monitor, i.e. a GC3 or a top tracer. Use carry. We can't predict how the ball will react when it actually hits the surface. It might be harder, it might be softer, there might be longer grass, it might be upslope, downslope, lots of factors to take in. That being said, the data that has been provided to us by ShotScope is all done on total distance. When tracking this, it's done by using the watch and then using the tagging system, so that would take into account the rolling in data. I sort of say 5 to 10 yards off these numbers, you would get round about where the carry number would be generally for the average golfer. I will throw up some TrackMan stats as well for the PGA Tour golfer to see actually where those guys are, and also a good yardstick, I always say, if you're a mid-handicapper, is where the LPGA TrackMan stats are. That's something to look at if you're around that sort of mid-handicap bracket, because they're round about where you would be hitting it as well. I'll flash those up now as well. But for myself, we saw that my 7-iron was carrying 178 yards. Now, I felt a little bit slower today. Normally, I would see that being 182. That's one thing, as I mentioned earlier, when the guys are going to different comps each week, they factor things like this in. How's the body feeling? Is it flying further through the air? So for me, 178. Now, I asked you a question of what you thought the average golfer would be carrying it in yards, and I would hesitate a guess that everyone will be commenting 150 yards. And I think that is due to driving ranges. If you think of a driving range, generally have your sequential boards going out from 50 yards all the way up to 250, 300 has now started to be added in more. But when we would be hitting that 7-iron, the 150 generally would be the board that we would get closest to. You might carry it just by it, you might carry it just shy of it, and it rolls up. So that's the number that sticks in your mind. Now, when we dive into some of this data here, for a 15 handicapper that we will class as our mid-handicapper, their number is 154 yards. Bear in mind, that is total distance, so take off that 5 to 10 yards and we're round about there. Now, think to yourself, are you actually in that bracket? Because one thing that happens, which we would expect to happen, is a trend between handicap and age. As your handicap starts to plummet, if you work from, let's say, a 15 handicapper down to a 5 handicapper, we see actually 10 yards gain there. So from 154 yards to 164 yards. Difference though, if we took 10 years into account, we would see something very different. Obviously, we would expect, as we know, as we get older, we sort of think of it as a bell curve. It's not a linear line. We would expect to get stronger as we get older, hit the top of the bell, and then start to come down. And that is very much true in distance. We see that at 30 years of age, you would peak in terms of your distance being 162 yards average. From there then, add 10 years on, 40 years old, you're only going to be losing 4 yards here. Think of the difference between the handicap. From 5 handicap to 15 handicap, we saw 10 yards difference. In 10 years difference, we actually only see 4 yards difference. Now that we know those, A, are you shocked by them? Also, I'm just going to flash up the PGA Tour average, which I thought was actually going to be a little bit longer. 7-iron is 176 yards of carry for those there, and then actually for the LPGA Tour averages, we see that it is 143 yards of carry. So, you know, like I say, for that mid-handicapper, 143, 154 on total distance with the shot scope data. Take that 5 to 10 yards off, we're somewhere in that bracket. But are you shocked by those numbers? And I guess the question to ask is, A, what is your number? Have you actually tracked it? And then is it something that actually matters to you? Are you thinking, oh, well, I need to get a little bit longer? Are you above average? How does your dispersion then actually counter into that? But also take into account factors like golf clubs nowadays. If you're playing with a friend who's just bought a brand new set of irons this year, and you're playing with something that is maybe 5, 10 years older, you're probably going to be 1 club shorter, I would hesitate to guess that, because the lofts have now changed on a lot of irons. A 7-iron, somewhere round about 37 degrees back in old money, as where now we're seeing them really cranked, you know, sometimes even getting into the high 20s, but really at the low end of the 30-degree spectrum. So your 7-iron might be 4 degrees actually weaker than your friend's who's hitting it 10 yards further than you. So don't feel bad about that. There's multiple factors, like I say. Golf ball can play a part, age can play a part, technique, how you're actually swinging the golf club has a huge impact on this. So interesting to see, and like I say, for me, 154 minus that 5 to 10, we're in and around that 150 number. Now let's have a look at the rest of my clubs and stop at driver and see what the numbers are there, because that's the one, again, where I think we get a little bit out of whack. Now it's time for the big dog. Comment down below what you think the driver is going. Put driver, you guess. 7-iron, you guess. Ooh, because a lot of people tend to misjudge this one as well. Right then, come on. Now, if I ask you the question of how far do you hit your driver, I'm going to hazard a guess that 250 is being typed as we speak. Generally, again, when we think back to the driving range scenario, 250 used to be the longest board. And when we think of golf holes, generally around about 360 yards on average for a par 4, when we hit our great shot in there, we might be going in with a wedge, but we'll generally be going in with round about that 7 or 8 iron when we've hit a really good one. So we take the difference. Oh, we're at 250. Not maybe so the case when we look at some facts here. Now for our 15 handicapper, again for this one, I would maybe take 10 to 15 yards off these numbers, because these are the total distance, as well if we think of carriers, what we want to be working in. For the 15 handicapper, we see it being at 236 yards, so 226, 220 maybe for the average golfer being at that 15 handicap bracket. And again, when we drop down to the 5 handicap bracket, we see that incremental gain in distance, 261 yards now. Again, what happens when we look at age? Is it as big a drop? Well, the answer is no. It's very much similar to what we see with the 7-iron. At 30, you hit that peak of where your distance is. So unfortunately, if you are past the 30s and like me, nearly entering your 40s, get ready to lose a few yards, unless you can do a Benjamin Button and re-age and actually gain some yardage. But 30-year-olds, 256 yards is the number. When we jump to the 40-year-old, 252 yards versus 243 when we get to the 50-year-old. We'll flash up the other yardages here now. And actually one of the other debates that is worth having is it worth actually teeing off with a 3-wood versus driver? Well, the answer is no, because actually we see that the driver distance for the 30-year-old is 226 versus 256 for the 30-year-old with driver. So a huge 30-yard gap, and actually the actual dispersion gap is nowhere near that. It is very, very minimal when we see the driver versus 3-wood dispersion gap there. So actually, should you tee off with a driver versus 3-wood, I'd probably stick to the driver, peg it down a little bit and learn to get a little bit more control of it. So an interesting set of numbers there. And like I say, some distances there that maybe shock you, maybe don't. Have a look at what yours are, but I think the big takeaway for me is all about actually going and doing this. Like I said earlier in the video, PGA Tour, DP World Tour, LPGA Tour, they are doing this on a weekly basis. And if you're being honest with yourself now, when was the last time you did it? Did you do your full bag? Were they correct numbers? Were you working off carry numbers? I doubt maybe more than 25% of people watching this video have done a gapping test in the last 6 months. So it is something that is worth doing, because when you actually get it right and you know your distances when you're out on the golf course, it makes approach play a lot easier. You will gain a lot more shots, because if you had that number in your mind of 150 that you were hitting your 7-iron, and we saw that it's actually a little bit less than that, and maybe you're an 18-20 handicapper, you might be doing yourself a little bit of an injustice, because you hit a good shot, you've got 150 in your mind, it pulls up at 135. Oh no, it didn't go as far as I thought. I'm now in the bunker or water, and it's a shot lost. So an interesting one for me there, one that I wanted to do and just spend a little bit of time on. And as well, make sure you work back on those 3 points that I mentioned about at the start of the video when you are going to do your gapping session, which I know all of you are now going to do, just like you're going to watch this video here that will help you stop making a few common mistakes out on the golf course.